All right, everyone, we start out today with our good friends in the corporate media, which, by 2020, some of these groups will be an afterthought. That's the silver lining to this. They are now openly coordinating in preparation, like it's not even the midterms yet. They haven't even culminated. They don't even know what the composition of the Senate and the House will be going forward for 2 years. They're already colluding with one another, and I mean in link in the description in the most literal sense, openly colluding with one another's broadcasting agencies like NBC and ABC and all these groups, getting together and saying, well, what proportion of our coverage is going to be related to Trump? Because Trump's, his strategy. And I suppose that give them at least a few brownie points for realizing what's being done, even if it's unavoidable tabloid heroin. I don't think their strategy will work. What they're going to try to do is to counter the fact that Trump says, a lot of wide sweeping, sometimes unimaginable things, and, gets very, loud on stage and insults people and takes to Twitter and says stuff that occasionally is off the wall. Especially like he'll spell something incorrectly despite having perfect verbal grasp. He's fine when it comes to English. When he misspells something, usually it's an attempt to get it more attention because people spread it around more by saying, oh, our president can't spell. It's a very crude propaganda tactic that works basically every time. They're going to, I think, try to counter this by shutting him out. That is, you can expect the corporate media will at first at least make an attempt to drain energy away from his campaign by simply not covering it. The problem is this. For most of Trump's fans that have come to the understanding that the news media fucking hates Donald Trump, they're probably not paying as much attention to those corporate entities anymore. The alt media over the next 2 years, despite constant attempts at censorship and suppression of the alternative media by Silicon Valley, by the corporate media's, smear campaigns and stuff, and in some cases by foreign states or even domestic politics. Despite that, the alt media is still growing at a fantastic rate compared to the old guard. Missing link media is dead in the water. The cable news style media in 2 years will be considerably weaker than it is now. They're fighting one another over a shrinking pond. I've pointed this out. It's like when MSNBC shot up the list, people are like, oh, well, see, cable news media isn't dying. Yes, but they drained all that away from CNN. CNN is left hemorrhaging. The total pool of people in any given time slot paying attention to cable programming has been shrinking continuously for a decade now, and it shows no sign of stopping. In fact, with the new generation, it's shrinking even faster. The oldest generations that watch cable at higher rates are beginning to age in some cases. You've got people that are 80, 90 years old. Yes, what do you think the average lifespan is for one of the viewers of these programs? The average age of a CNN viewer is 68 years old. For Fox, it's 67. It was the oldest. It was 69. Now it's, I think, 67. That's old. And again, no offense to my older audience, but that's not somebody in their 20s. It's not somebody in their 30s. It's not somebody in their prime of life, exactly. And so this is what they have to deal with. Well, in a couple of years, a lot of those individuals won't even be in the land of the living, and a lot of them keep cutting the cable too. Regardless of age range, you get everything from Gen Z, which more than half of them don't even watch cable, up to, people who are still hanging around for the silent generation or something. Someone who remembers the Truman administration, cutting the cable. It's like Grandma finally got really upset at Anderson Cooper and said, fuck it. And now she uses YouTube. Now she's watching Styx Hexenhammer. She's the cool grandma. She's or your cool wine aunt watching like Malnu coverage or something. And that's what you get. So the alt media, which was already important in 2015, 2016, but it wasn't the main sort of media group in the entire world, is going to be much more like it. And as alt tech grows, that's a big thing too. The suppression in Silicon Valley is starting to drive other platforms that are becoming viable now that are far, far larger, where memes could already spread around. They could already be both in a grassroots and in a more propagandistic sense, spread around, manufactured, popularized, sort of given their keck, their sort of demonic seal energy, as some people would term it. By the way, Occult Memetics still available on Amazon as well. I think it's sold on Barnes & Nobles now as well, too. It's rather funny. Thousands of copies have been bought. It's actually one of my most popular works. It's hilarious. I expect that it'll probably pick up again around 2020, because we're going to have to discuss it. Just imagine, if 2016 was chaotic, just imagine how 2020 will be. The Democrats are already whirling around like whirling dervishes, going crazy, again, like salty tornadoes. Today you get Kavanaugh getting put in there. You probably, in the next couple of years, get Ginsburg either having no choice but to retire or dying because she's, she's in her mid-80s. How much she can barely hold her head up. How much longer can she uphold the law, essentially? The corporate media, meanwhile, is openly colluding to try to combat Trump. And they're doing this because corporations don't like Trump. The big multinational conglomerates within the media and certain other forms of corporations don't like Trump at all, which is odd because usually Republicans are the ones that are corporation friendly. Trump's tax code's more populistic, and really, other than energy and military sector groups, he's not attempting to shield the big conglomerates. It's like, didn't Amazon just decide to give its workers $15 an hour, like they're conforming to the minimum wage thing? So they're like, hey, all your other benefits that you got, your stock, any other stuff that you ever got, we're taking it all away. We have no choice in order to pay for this higher minimum wage. Thanks, California. That'll happen in a lot of cases. That's what happens under socialism. The corporations are powerful enough to find workarounds. They'll drag the state through court for the next 30 years or something. Corporate media, meanwhile, doesn't like Trump. A lot of these outlets, you've got to understand, are not fundamentally U.S. firms at all. They're multinational firms. That is, you've got a multinational company. It's got holdings in 5-6 different nations. One of them happens to be a U.S.-based firm, but it still takes some of its marching orders from that central multinational firm that has no actual national loyalty whatsoever. Now, I would think that U.S. media, predominantly, if they're going to say, like, America first, wave the flag, we're a U.S. fucking news group, you should be primarily a U.S. news group. I don't have any problem with the concept of a firm operating in multiple countries or of a parent company owning properties in multiple countries. But a lot of times they don't like it when you talk about the fact that they exist in this state, because that they try to be like, oh, well, we're hyper-patriotic and shame on Trump for being populistic. It's like, oh, that's because you're a conglomerate, a multinational corporation. You love, overseas work and tax schemes and stuff. Of course, you want the U.S. to operate under economic globalism because you are globalistic in the way that you do your business. Even Trump Incorporated, it's a multinational conglomerate. Trump has properties all over the world. It just happens to be predominantly based within the United States and known as a U.S. brand. Like a lot of the stuff is strictly domestic, like Trump steaks, which I don't think are made anymore. A Trump wine, which actually is still around. And some of this others, the MAGA hat production. It was funny, some people were trying to claim they were made in China, and then they're like, oh yeah, those are the knockoff hats that they're probably being sold by opportunistic liberals or something. Now, as both a propaganda strategy and a money-making strategy. Now, it's funny to see these groups that supposedly they're private entities that compete. They're like my free market, my freedom of expression, and yet you're taking your marching orders from some mullah or something, or from some country that's run by literal tyranny. As far as your other businesses go, it's kind of like Apple weighing in on U.S. policy. Who fucking cares what you think? You employ literal child slaves by the thousands or tens of thousands in communist China, and you're trying to weigh in on what the U.S. economic and social policy should be? We're very worried about workers' rights here in the United States under this evil Trump administration. Just ignore the suicide nets in all of our factories over in fucking East Asia. You see, therein lies the difference. The corporate media is even worse, though, because until fairly recently, they were the barons of human communication. Look, the uprising of individual content creation in the alt media online is really like the proliferation of certain small and new business fronts in the wake of the end of the Gilded Age, because essentially the situation had changed economically. In that case, it was the result of the early progressive, the trust-busting, anti-monopoly law sort of era. In this case, it's the result of the steady movement of technological progress. The rise of the internet has made it possible for people who have the same talent as any newscaster, sometimes more. They're just as talented, they're just as honest in some cases, many times I would argue a lot more honest, much more efficient. In every way, they are better than the old corporate media. But until the rise of relatively recent internet production, it was impossible for them to actually make their mark on the world. Like what I'm doing here would have been impossible even, 20 years ago. Even in the early stage of the internet, what would I have? I'd have a .com, there'd be some primitive 240p video on the site, and it'd be like 10 videos there, and I'd call it a day. Now, of course, I can make multiple videos a day, cross-platform, put them out on 4 different platforms, collate them out through 3 other different websites, Minds, Gab, and Twitter. I have a Facebook page that I never use, like a Vimeo account that I never do anything with. People still occasionally subscribe to me there, which is really fun. I just took it so that someone else couldn't impersonate me, really. There's nothing there really worth watching. Or PewTube, stopped uploading there. It was slower. It's probably better now, but I already use BitChute, I already use Steam, and I already use Dailymotion. Enough is enough. Meanwhile, I can do that like a one-man army, and it takes like a fucking dozen people to produce a couple hours worth of coverage on a major cable network. They need $1 million and a couple dozen staff members, plus they need the big cushy offices, and then they have these 7-figure pundits actually delivering for those slots. That's what they need to produce even a small amount of coverage each day, and they do it 24/7. They need literally hundreds or thousands of people to do it, and the backing of a multinational. And they have to have like an entire corporate office complex, like a fucking skyscraper in Manhattan, just to deliver the news to an audience that is steadily shrinking and already has been eclipsed by just some larger YouTubers. Like, there are people, all they do is do shit on YouTube and maybe like a podcast, like a Crowd or a Paul Joseph Watson. They dwarf these individuals that are working for these conglomerates. And they can do it for 1/10 the cost or like 5% the cost. The corporate media openly colluding isn't really a surprise. There's a foregone conclusion, but they've been doing this with regards to other things. It's not just, we must stop Trump, we must agree upon, trying to shut him out of our coverage to drain, some of the enthusiasm away. It's not just that, they've been doing it to the alt media too. They haphazardly have this weird sort of process by which at one moment they'll ignore and then the next moment they all talk about it and smear. Like with the Data Society report. It was not organic, the fact that this was so widely reported on, and not refuted by any of these groups that supposedly compete with one another. That's about all. Peace out.